This is Winnie. I'm going to give you a quick rundown about civilizations and their rise and fall. This is going to go with your guide. If you do not have a guide, please ask for one because we're going to start moving. The biggest thing, history was filled with civilizations that once were in their peak state of mind. The crops were going, the people were running, all of that. Eventually, everything comes to an end, right? We call that the word collapse. Collapse means the fallout or the demise of a civilization. It's important to understand the falls and why certain civilizations went through and eventually collapsed. This helps us not repeat history, and overall it helps modern society prevent similar outcomes. So let's get started. The first one is economic instability. Thinking about economic instability, there's a bunch of different ways this shows up, right? The first one is financial crisis. The next way it can show up is it can show up through inflation. Inflation could be gas prices increasing. It could be the cost of eggs going up. Those are ways that we see that today. When cost of goods go up, it usually challenges the economy in one direction or another. The next one is unsustainable policies. Which eventually will weaken civilizations. So these are some of the ways that economic instabilities can show up. If you want to think about an example of how this would show up, you could turn and talk to your peers. Ways that my hours talked about it, a big one was COVID. When COVID hit, people would lose their jobs, and then cost of goods would go up. Jobs lost, goods go up, right? Another way this could show up is if you remember back to world history, there's the Great Depression, and so on, right? Moving on to the next one, there's environmental changes. This can show up in a ton of ways, and this is increasing in how we see it lately. The first one would be climate shifts. The next one would be deforestation. And this shows up in an example like right here, right? The next one, resource depletion. Ooh. Leads to decline. You could think of a couple of examples of this on your own. I want you to add next to on your sheet where it says B. So on your sheet, you'll see like A, B, C, D. So next to B, and you give your answers over here. I want you to add something in this area about an example of how that shows up. One big example to think about, and like a sentence started to get you started, is what's happening in Canada right now. Another one would be using these images, specifically this image, as a help, okay? Political corruption, this is a hot topic. This is what the majority of my students polled as their biggest concern when it comes to the corruption of modern day societies. This can come in a ton of different ways. The big one is weak leadership. The next one is power struggles. Inefficiency to create stability, right? I think a really great thing for all of you to do is think about how this shows up in your small-scale government as well as your large-scale government. Local government would be the city of Milwaukee. High-scale government would obviously be Donald Trump in the White House, right? A couple of different ways of how this shows up. Again, I want you to do the same thing you did with environmental. Add a note on the side in that margin What are two examples that you can think of today that relate to political corruption when you're thinking about the fall of a society? External conflicts. All of you have heard of these before. Maybe you're just not connecting to this vocab word. War and invasions, right? When countries come from overseas or neighboring countries, it can ultimately drain your resources. When thinking about what are resources, this could be an example of water, food, access to resources. This shows up in the Middle East today when we think about Gaza, right? Middle East today when we think about Gaza. This can also disrupt society, right? If loved ones are being torn apart, if you're unable to get goods, you're fighting over what little you do have. Those are two examples that I just listed out. Try to list a third, again, in that margin. Social unrest. First big one is class struggles. Who is the top of the food chain? Who is the bottom of the food chain, right? How do they compare and how do they have access to materials? Inequalities. Revolts. Think to yourself, what is a common word, or what is the common day comparison to what a revolt is? Because we don't say revolts today. What do we say instead? Usually we say protest. So revolts, they ultimately weaken society, right? Because they're breaking up different groups. And this goes on to social structures as well. Add an example of a protest that you have seen in your own experience, and maybe add a little bit of context to it in that side margin. Thinking about technological stagnation, so the slowdown of technological process with no inventions, no improvements, nothing happening. It's like when you get stuck in a rut, right? If this is the norm, and we're not figuring out how to improve efficiency, it can often lead to a slowdown of progress and ultimately being disconnected. The Roman Empire. So this is where we're starting to segue into more specific examples. The decline of Roman Empire slowed down multiple factors. They had issues with economic issues because they couldn't figure out how to control the monetary issues. With military, they were fighting with different neighboring countries, and they were having issues with who would lead them as a group. So there was a large population of political corruption and instability. Again, going back, political corruption comes from weak leadership, power struggles, and an inefficiency to create stability. Some of these big buildings here would be where government would be held. In Rome, they were having issues deciding who would be that republic and who would lead them in that capacity as well. In contrast, the Mayan civilization began to exhaust their resources. They were having issues with droughts. So going back up to this environmental here, this is what a drought would look like. There was no land. There was no land to farm. When there's no land to farm, what do they not have? Food. So when they don't have food, they've exhausted their resources. They were hit with a series of droughts, and ultimately people panicked. When they didn't have access to goods and resources, what do people often do? They often leave. One way you could think about this is they abandoned the Mayan civilization, they migrated, which means to move to in search of a better location or a better area and supply. Unlike Rome, the Indus Valley civilization did not fall to war or to political corruption. They were actually doing pretty solid over the years. We learned about this last year in world history. Without enough food, though, people will either starve or fight over limited food, and ultimately they'll leave for better conditions and migrate again. So we're seeing a cycle of a couple of things, right? When things are good, people will migrate to them, right? They will want to travel, like we were talking about in the Mayan civilization and then the Indus Valley. When their goods aren't being met there, they're traveling somewhere else. They're traveling somewhere that has stability. Stability means that there is consistent control and order in that nation, or in that city-state, or in that location.